Where and here.
All right. Well, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this adaptive reuse webinar. As you all get settled in, I just have a few reminders before we get started. Please use the Q&A section for any questions today, and remember to be constructive with any of those questions or comments to the presenter or to one another to ensure that we have a session that is productive. AIA California will submit one AIA Learning Unit and HSW for those who complete the session live. And as always, the webinar content and additional resources will be available online shortly after this session. Today's webinar will explore two unique adaptive reuse projects from our awards program. As previously stated, this qualifies for one AIA Learning Unit and HSW. For those watching live, AIA California will report these for you once you have finished the session in full. Please allow up to 10 business days for the credits to be posted to your transcript. Now, I would very quickly like to introduce the projects and their presenters. From our Urban Design Awards, we have honor recipient project Township Commons, located in Oakland, California. This project was done by Einwiller Kuehl Landscape Architecture. Our speaker today is from the firm and is the co-founder, Sarah Kuehl, ASLA. And then our next project is the Design Awards Merit Recipient Project, Ford Motor Company Building WMG, located in Los Angeles, California. This project was done by Rockefeller Kemple Architects. Our speakers from that firm today are the co-founders Rocky Rockefeller, AIA, and Chris Kemple, AIA NCARB. With that, we're going to get started first with the Ford Motor Company building, and I'd like to hand it off to Rocky and Chris.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. We're here to talk about our project that we recently completed. We're here to talk about our project that we recently completed. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm here on the right. This is me, Chris. This is Rocky on the left. And the co-founders of our firm, we're a medium-sized firm here in El Segundo. These are the folks that are actually the team and the dream behind what it is that we do. We're more than adaptive reuse architects. We have completed projects as small as 170 square feet. This is our fun little treehouse project up in Mandeville Canyon, and recently completed a 400,000 square foot plus high-rise in Long Beach. And we take that type of knowledge, that which we learn between our custom residential work and our adaptive reuse and ground up commercial work, and apply it to very complicated projects. And the results are beautiful, complex homes. There's one up in Oregon. And a recent winner, or wasn't that recent, but a winner of an Adaptive Reuse Award and Design Merit Award here in Los Angeles. This is the Spreckles Sugar Building that was converted to condominiums. But as we know, these projects, they don't start looking like this. Rather, those beginnings look something more like this. And that's what we're here to talk to you about, is the story about how we got from essentially, or how we got to this particular state of our projects, beginning with something that looked like this. Our work spans all across Los Angeles, 20 plus years old in terms of our partnership and our work, these highlighted pieces. Yes?
Your audio is cutting out. Do you mind seeing if you can adjust it? Thank you.
Sure. This is a map of our current work, and our beginnings are in some of these yellows. This is the one on the very far right next to the LA River. For those of you familiar with Los Angeles, is the project where you can get into a little bit more depth. And just to share some of the breadth of our experience in our 15-person firm, these are some of the projects that were more recently completed.
Hi, Chris, I'm so sorry, but it's really, really cutting out. It's hard to understand you.
Okay.
How's that? Better.
Sorry about that.
Maybe better. How's that?
You sound clear right now.
Great. This is our first adaptive reuse project.
It just started doing it again. It just started talking again. I'm so sorry, Chris.
This is our first adaptive reuse project. Can you hear us okay? Or me okay? How's that? Great. In 2002, there's a Douglas building. This is not what it looked like in the beginning. Part of our adaptive reuse is the beauty of discovery. And in this particular case, in this project, we discovered some beautiful frieze work and some original architectural detailing behind that, which was covered up on the outside and as well as on the inside. All of this was restored. These column capitals and everything was restored back to its original condition. On the left is what we started with in terms of this historic stairwell, and you can see that the end of our passion for our adaptive reuse work ends in something that's beautiful. But we're here to talk primarily about a project that spanned about a decade. It started as essentially two phases: the Ford Motor Company building, as well as the Warner Music Group tenant improvement. This is what the project ultimately looked like, and it's in its current state today. It's a beautiful, large building. It sits on the corner of 7th and Santa Fe. It's a very long building that has multiple heights to it. The area on the far right, what we're calling the Tower Building, was the very first structure built in 1913. You can see the hand drawing that was part of our discovery period and the early understandings of the building in the bottom right. The Assembly Building was built and constructed about 10 years later in 1923, and that's where the Ford cars were actually made. And the Studio Building on the far left is something that was added on to the project in the 80s. So I'm going to turn this over to Rocky Rockefeller, who has a passion for adaptive reuse work. And Rocky, you can take it from here.
Can you see? Is that the right slide? Great.
Yes.
Unbelievable. So the first slide, I just thought it'd be fun to talk about adaptive reuse and sort of its roots, but this is something totally different. This is Charles Darwin, and he's saying it's not the strongest of the species that survived, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I think adaptive reuse is a lot of that. You start with a building that was used for something, in this case, manufacturing, that used to have railroad cars coming from Detroit, dropping off all kinds of parts and pieces, and then being assembled in this tower. And at the time, cars ended up often on the roof. There were very large elevators, and the building was somewhat inefficient. And of course, as time went on, Ford, he figured out that things need to be more like an assembly line, So he built this second long assembly line building, almost 410 feet long. There was 2 stories, daylight lit, and much used. You can see how it might have looked in the beginning. And then when we started, the Imperial Toy Company had owned it for many years. They had kind of trashed it. You notice the lower 2 floors are completely solid, and that's solid with a capital S, both concrete, stucco, metal panels. Everything was attached to this thing to keep the riffraff out. And that all had to be taken apart. This is another shot of it. This is from what became the parking garage. And on the right-hand side, you see what somebody had done in their brilliance to build a cold storage in the 90s. There was a tilt-up cold storage building, and they just kind of glued it onto the building. So that had to be removed. You can see, starting with the Imperial Toy, to what we ended up on the right side was the final restored project, not the least of which was a very large number of industrial windows. Those windows, here's some that were closed in. On that earlier photo I showed you, was all stucco and concrete. And as we pulled that stuff away, we found they had chipped off a lot of things, broken things. Windows were still there, but they were really disgusting. So had to clear that up. And we found the doors that the train went down both sides of this building, and they would open these giant doors. And these are very large doors. And so those doors were remade as windows, essentially, and put back in place. But most of them, in this case, was fairly low, but most of them were fairly high off the ground, so couldn't be used as doors anymore. The roof, this is the assembly line roof. This is 4 clerestories that are each over 400 feet long that were operable, where each of those panels of glass are about 6 feet to 7 feet tall, and they were operable by a chain drive. So the factory could be opened up for air to come in low and high and sort of cool the space without having, of course, no air conditioning in those days. Here's a shot of the building in its completed form and how we restored it, brought it back. And then this is looking back at what it was. So kind of fun to look at it a little differently, but all that stuff had to be cleaned up and taken off. So it's a big part of adaptive reuse. Here's the scaffolding. You can see, if we go back one, you see the water tower sort of in the middle, upper middle of the picture. Here's the water tower as we were restoring the building. Now, again, it was a twofer. So what I mean by that is it was done in 2 different pieces. So our phase 1 was for Shorenstein in San Francisco, a developer who purchased the building from the Imperial Toy Company, and we restored the building from them, for them. And we called that the Ford Factory, and it was a core and shell historic restoration. As part of that, we were required by the city to build a garage. So as you can see on the lower right part of that, you see a garage going up. So we designed a 600-car parking garage, and it really was sort of the key to being allowed to use this building for office space down there in the Arts District. So currently, I think there's 900 employees in the building. There is a lot of parking, and then also, as you'll be able to see in the coming screens, we created an outdoor amenity space. So the project became very sustainable in the Shorenstein project. We were given a LEED Gold, awarded LEED Gold for it. Of course, we relied heavily on some of the existing parts of the building, like the natural daylighting, all those existing clerestories down the old assembly line. And in the original tower, they had this sawtooth, which we'll show in a minute, that lit up the center of the building on the upper floor. A lot of bike parking, in addition to car parking. There's public transit running down the street, parking right in front of our building and two sides. A lot of PV charging. And then we created this paseo, this park between the two buildings where we'd pulled away the cold storage building. So a lot of there's a water garden that runs in this paseo, and the paseo is quite large, so holds a lot of people. It's a place to go and hang out. Of course, the salvaging of historic structures and use of sustainable materials were pretty much key. And there's a water plant that we even installed for mechanical. You can see the linear park. It's pretty long. I think it's over 300 feet long. It's about 75 feet wide. And here's a shot of the tower and how it was altered as we went through the second phase, which we were then hired by Warner Music Group, and we partnered with Rockwell Group to do the second phase, which was occupancy of the building. So those are great projects for everybody. You start with one, you do the core and shell, and then the second one is you build it out for the future tenant of the building. Here's the paseo. It's a wonderful space. To the right of that, inside the building, is the commissary, a very nice commissary for them to use. On the left is the parking garage, and there's lots of places to sit and enjoy. Really, the sort of before and after, I'll give you a little tour through there, but the building was there, it was concrete. So the original tower was all cast in place concrete, very stout building. The assembly line was a mixed building. So it was concrete on the lower level, steel on the upper level. And you can start to see how we developed those rooms. And here's a listening room where that's the same shot. All four of those shots are the same. And this is how it got occupied. The assembly building was really interesting. So they had this assembly line running down this building. And it ran down 400 feet, turned around and came back. And when they got to the other end, it was a car. So this was all on the second floor. It's a steel structure on top of a concrete structure. So there's those of you that do podium work, you understand this completely. But in this case, all those windows were operable. You can see a lot of the hardware that opened those windows up. Very stout structure. And then as it got renovated, it turned into these kind of beautiful spaces. So these are those sawtooth windows I talked about. They weren't hardly evident when we started. There was concrete vaults that had been part of the aging of this building. It had been the Ford factory. Then it had been used to manufacture airplane motors during the Second World War. After that, Bullocks purchased the building and used it for fur storage. So on the fifth floor, a series of concrete vaults were built, all of which had to be taken back to get us back to historic. And this was part of that. So on the right, you can see the finished piece. We did cut a hole between the fourth and fifth floor, and that daylight comes down and helps that fourth floor feel even brighter and more daylit. Here's a good shot of it, showing that sawtooth window, and this is from the other direction. So you can see it really helps to brighten up and open up and make the space transparent. Between Rockwell and Rockefeller Kemple, we probably space planned this 4 times before we got the multi-headed client on board. So Warner Music Group, which is a combination of 6 different labels, kind of the West Coast headquarters for Warner, all had different ideas about what they'd like. So architects in the audience probably knows that can be a little challenging. It was a stout building. This is a picture from, I think it's dated 1936. Somebody wanted to know how strong those floors were. So this is a load test, which is 108 tons, which is 300 pounds a square foot, which is pretty stout. Those floors are thick. The minimum floor thickness is about 12 inches, the max about 18, depending on where you are. Column heads, a lot of those column heads were added later to help distribute the load. The original columns probably were starting to punch. So over the early life of this building, it was changed. So about the time that the Model A came out, so the Model T, those were built here from about the beginning, 1913, all the way up until about 1927. And then they started building the Model A's, which were heavier. So then we got in there and we made a mess of it because we had to seismically retrofit it. So a lot of this work is helping to create where we're going to tie this building together. Nabi Yosef was the structural engineer for both phases. This is the core and shell phase where we actually had to dig out. Those are the old layer cake foundations and the columns and the old column capitals, figure out what was in there, and then, of course, reinforce it, pour a new foundation, which was enormous. And there you go. The shear walls were created around each of the stair towers, and those created these concrete boxes about 4 foot thick and square to the order of maybe 30 by 30. Rockwell, excellent interior design firm. They helped us. This is their model of the center stage that we then created for this whole presentation area. This is how it was done. Here's a sort of a robot demo, taking away the floor. You can see the thickness of the floor. And then here's the final center stage space, which is really wonderful. They can present almost to their entire staff. Someone can come in and perform. The racks on the top of the screen are motorized lights and speakers. Here's the lobby, which sort of intimates all the different Warner Music Group nameplates. And then here's a shot from that lobby looking into the center stage. And to the left is the commissary, and to the right are listening rooms and areas for them to gather. And this is sort of a final shot that shows you that whole center stage. And we'd just like to say thank you.
Really cool to see this, Rocky. I think I'm going to jump in. Is that right, Ashley?
Absolutely. Take it away, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. Let me just get this in the right mode and then I will be good to go. There we go. Can everyone see this? Someone give me a thumbs up. I see someone nodding. Okay, great. So I'm so delighted to be here. We were super honored to win an award from the AIA. We're landscape architects, and so it feels like a special honor to win an AIA award. And we won in the category of urban design. And so I'm going to tune my remarks a little bit to be about adaptive reuse in thinking about larger scale and urban design, and tell you about a project called Township Commons, which is in Oakland. First, I want to introduce our firm for half a second. We are 16 people and we have one office in Oakland, California. Actually, that's currently not true. We are renting one office and we have one office under construction, but we are one group of people and we will soon be in our new office. And we work mostly on things in the greater California area, so up to Calistoga, down to Big Sur, and we have one or two outliers, but we're pretty local in terms of our work. And the reason for that is that we really like to go deep in our relationships. And so that's with fabricators or contractors or nurserymen or clients or others, and to sort of see how far we can get based on the depth of those relationships. Our firm has done a number of projects that are in the sort of adaptive reuse and renovation space. And I was thinking about, when do I choose to call something adaptive reuse and when do I choose to call it renovation? And it made me think that adaptive reuse is that moment when it sort of is somehow transcendent of what it was before and not merely improved, that it's somehow fundamentally changed. And so this is a project that we did at Uptown Station in downtown Oakland, where there was no roof deck on a building, and we came back and retrofit the drainage and inserted really a landscape environment on the 6th floor of this. And we really like to do these kind of complicated projects. I think they're the ones that tug at our heart and keep our minds very, very awake and curious. And we've also done this on the ground. And so this is a project on the left for a residence up in Calistoga, which had 3 existing structures, which you see in the picture, which were renovated by Bolin Sawinski Jackson, and a landscape that, if you can believe it, was almost entirely paved between the structures when we started. And so getting to work on resetting buildings and thinking at the scale of the site, even with existing structures, is something we think about a lot, and I think informed our work. And then on the right is a recently completed courtyard in 101 California, which is a Philip Johnson building, and wrestling with what I think is a pretty spectacular floor plan, and figuring out how to work into that in complicated conditions was also super satisfying. I think that kind of spirit of being invested in what's hard and invested in discovery is really a lot of what we brought to the project at Township Commons. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about that project and about that site as a way to talk about adaptive reuse in urban design. And as landscape architects, we often go back to sort of the base ecology. And at this place, it was water. It's not a native plant story. It really was a watery place. And I like this MyBridge photo because it shows that there are always people in industrial places. We sometimes think, well, it was industrial and I brought people there, but usually there are people there even when it is an industrial place. And the things that they do, like this man taking a moment to rest and sit and really connect with the water on a railroad track, really inspire us to think about how to connect people to the natural world when we think about our designs. So for those of you who don't know the Bay Area, Oakland is the sunny side of the bay. San Francisco is just off page left on the image on the left. And it is a place where we have a fair amount of industrial uses, including the Port of Oakland, that will remain. We also have sort of the rediscovery of our waterfront and people wanting to live there and go there and use it. And we have a kind of patchwork of things where we're trying to stitch things together and weave people through, but allow people to connect back to the water. And the project site for Township Commons, I put a tiny little pink circle on it in the foreground here, was the old 9th Avenue terminal, which was kind of the original Amazon warehouse. It was a break bulk facility for getting things off of boats and onto trains and trucks. And it was off of this body of water, which is called the Oakland Estuary. Historically, that terminal, you can see the little black rectangle over here, was really in water and in marsh and along a creek before this was channelized into the Oakland Estuary and more land was built. And so we've been thinking about the project in terms of looking back to sort of this watery moment and this marshy moment. And then also thinking about the break bulk terminal, where you see a photo of the 9th Avenue terminal here on the right with the railroad lines and the boats that were bringing in cargo. And then the inside of this warehouse, which was full of things that were coming off pallets and being broken up and redistributed. Also, as Rocky said, also a very stout building. When we actually started working on the project, it looked like this. And we arrived at the site and there had been some planning that had been done previously and a big battle about whether this was a place that merited historic preservation at the highest level as an entire building. And it was decided that it did not. And when we started, the developers were thinking that they would keep this front facade and maybe 1 or 2 bays, but no other parts of the building. And we walked the site, and these are some photos from that first day, and you can see the sort of fantastic scale of this. It's industrial sized. And the repetition and the quality of that repetition. And you can also see in the bottom right, that perfect order of marching out in a line gets bent at the end. And there's kind of a special moment where the building bends. And the reason for that is the building was built in 2 phases. You can see it in the roof. The white roof in the foreground was there. They added the gray roof in the background on the left, and they had to fit it into the curve of an existing railroad track, which is why it has the shape it does and why the trusses move here. And we thought that was a kind of marvelous reconciliation in a way at an urban design scale of building and sort of site system or larger systems. We also were asked to walk around with the question of, well, what should we keep? And so we walked around and we started looking at artifacts, things like these boat tie-offs from the Phoenix Iron Works, which is an amazing Oakland entity, looking at the facade, looking at the loading docks that you see here on the left, which were 4 feet up, but the site was being raised for sea level rise. So we knew we weren't going to have quite that relationship anymore. And the other thing that we started to notice is that a lot of what we were drawn to wasn't necessarily just the objects, but it was the spatial qualities of the place. And so when you walked on the railroad track designed curves, a long straight run that then sort of bent at a slow speed, you actually kept feeling like you were approaching the water. And that was a quality that was really important to us to maintain not just the things that we found on the site, but also some of the spatial conditions that we found on the site. The entire building sits on piers, and it is, like many California stories, also a story about a seismic upgrade. What you see in the top left is a linear section through the building. The piers and piles below are taller, really, in many cases, than the building itself, which is about 30 feet tall. And so when you're thinking about designing on it, there's also a sort of a structural geography of where you can put things and how you can think about what you can do on the new surface that was set forth in sort of close work with a structural engineer who was Sam Yao at SGH, who was a real partner with us in this. It was also a project where the existing conditions were failing in some cases, and you can see this pile report and a member of our office going out in a kayak to kind of understand relationships. And there were things where we had weak conditions and certain things couldn't go at the surface. We had other areas where piles would be removed, and then we had pretty strong conditions. And so knowing that the ground wasn't consistent, it had different conditions, even though we had a structural grid, actually felt really familiar to us as landscape architects. These are some photos during the construction, and for our seismic upgrade, we also have a very, very large concrete slab with a lot of rebar in it, which you see there on the right, to tie the deck together to comply with modern seismic code. And you can see on the left this photo of the demolition of some of the existing structure and going back to a kind of a quality of emptiness of the site. I have a good friend who often says the moment in architecture he likes best is when the scaffolds are still up and things are under construction. And I think some of the quality that we wanted to keep in our final project was a little bit of that tension between built and unbuilt and a bit indeterminate as a very interesting quality to space. And I think you'll see in some of the images, we think we succeeded in doing that. So The first project had another job to do in addition to being adaptive reuse. There are 3,100 units of housing that are being put in at Brooklyn Basin, which is the whole neighborhood that you see here on the left. And there is a park that runs continuously at the shoreline, and there are 4 parks total. This was the first one, and it had to succeed before anyone really lived here. There was going to be one building built and a small number of residents. And we knew that open space had to be a placemaker and a strong identity, but also draw enough people to come to it that this wouldn't become a kind of, blowing in the wind Antonioni movie where not great things happen in public space, that it had to have a quality of a true draw to succeed. And so you're seeing the site plan that we developed, and I'll go into a little more detail. The stormwater management for all of the parcels had been pre-decided, and it is going into what looks like the whale's tail over here. And then the 9th Avenue terminal, which is the building I was showing you, is really the whole footprint of the brightly rendered rectangle at the bottom, of which we kept 3 pieces. The quality of this place is a microclimate. It's south facing and it's warm in Oakland. And so it's a really lovely environment to be in. It's that little difference in terms of how warm or how cold it is outside that feels really good. And it has lovely big water views. When we started, we knew we wanted to keep some of the building, and we were required to keep sort of the first 2 bays of the building and the facade. But as we listened to the public and worked with the developer and thought about costs in terms of, well, what if I needed to build a big terminus at the end of it? We felt strongly that keeping more of the building was actually a really great move. And we spend a lot of time looking at projects where, especially landscape projects, where things are saved and they're just saved, but they're not transformed. And so one of our mandates was, we're going to save them, but we're going to make sure that they're transformed enough that they feel like an invitation to people to come and use them. That this is industrial size, but there's places that are scaled for people in it, and you're supposed to be here. And one of the pieces that we used to do that was using the loading docks in a new way. They provided a kind of scale and order and geography historically, and we maintained that as a way to keep this kind of intermediate scale onto the site and use that in different ways of expression. Whoops, I got too many. Let me go back one. The other thing we thought a lot about was we are within the state lands jurisdiction, so you're not allowed to have things like basketball courts and tot lots and playgrounds. There's a limitation on what you can do. And so we wanted movement itself, almost a trail project in the form of a park, to be really the most important program of this place. And we knew that we wanted it to be very clear that this was a recreational landscape and a park. So I'm set up our photos so that you're seeing 2 at once, because I think the best versions of urban design work this way. So they work both at the building scale and at the city scale at the same time. And I was thinking when I was younger, I often tried to take this photograph, which was both in focused and far away. And so I think a lot of what we tried to do was to make places within this park that were great places at a small scale that you could be in, but also places where you had a bigger relationship while you were in that smaller space. And so what you're seeing is actually an axis that on the left where you go through the facade of the old building and then you pop out on the right side under this roofed area, and then you can see the whole building and how that center axis organized things. And I think those sort of ideas about axiality and connection and relationship and long view are really important when you're doing something as spare as we were trying to do here. We also thought a lot about how to make spaces that felt comfortable. There's that kind of sublime awe moment where something's big and that's amazing, but you usually kind of want to keep going because, like, that was really cool. Now let me go find a comfortable place to sit down. And so finding that balance was important. And so we did it in different ways. On the left, what you're seeing is an area where we provided more shelter, a sense of roof, some nooks and things where you could get your back up against something more enclosure as a way to get scale. On the right, you're seeing adjacent to that an area where we have a giant flat deck, but we're using the patterning of the deck boards as a way to give different spaces to be. And then we were using furniture not as a plunk one, plunk one, plunk one, but as a kind of ganged up quality that that could compete and hold space. And so even though this is a giant, area of a wood deck, it has a quality where it feels comfortable to be there as someone who's human sized. The loading docks that I mentioned previously, you can see here, we use them to be our ADA access onto an elevated deck. So you can see this is loading dock 24, and we repurpose the tie-offs for that. And you go up onto the deck where you are slightly above the water and have a much more water in your eyeballs because of it. You kind of see over the guardrail. And then track that down onto the water's edge with these numbers that you're seeing that are the other loading docks that sort of mark your geography. And we worked with Volume, who we really love, on the environmental graphics for this. And these have become a kind of geography of, we're having our birthday party at 29, let's run until we get to 25. And they work in a different way now, which is exactly what we were hoping for. This shows you a similar view of that, of how the loading docks then track through the site and how we're getting a lot of scale out of just minor inflections in surface, really, and then how that's working to create space on the right. Oops. And then at the very beginning, I told you that this was a watery place and a marshy place. So we knew we wanted to call back to that and have some big planters of native grasses and other native plants that would kind of hold an edge between the bike lane, but also they provide habitat for birds in this area near the water, which is very desirable. But they do a lot of work here of telling you this is a place where people are supposed to be. And at the very end, the third piece of the building that we saved, it's the thing that you're sighting on from that first picture where you can actually see the hill, and it's about 8 feet tall as you sight down that center axis. And it becomes a space where you can occupy this industrial thing, and you can't quite, but you feel like you could reach up and touch the trusses. And we designed it in such a way that it would work for performance, but also it has a uncanny ability to make young children and architects run to the top of the hill, which is kind of fun about it too. I'll close by saying I think the test of public work and public space work is what after you're done, and what happens and what do you see people doing there. And it's been really satisfying for all of us to see the ways that people actually come and use the space. And we're doing some post-occupancy diagrams. We've learned a lot from doing that, and it's become a truly beloved place for roller skating. And has really been embraced by the community, which has been super satisfying. I think that's our test of success. I started by saying this is a place near water. And I think in many ways, the other test of how did we do and did we really succeed in transforming it is we've made an invitation for all of these people to come be near the water. And they do. They come at night, they come in the day, they have different experiences. There's a lot of dance that happens here, which is a pretty special thing. But there's just a lot of people who are now able to feel like they're on the water. And that's a really wonderful thing for the long-term ecological health and the connection to this giant piece of natural system that's happening right here. But in some ways, it's hard to get to the shoreline. So we're really proud of that. And I think I'll just close by saying I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And I think these kinds of projects in terms of taking care of what we have and repairing and reusing, but also doing it with a strong intention of what do we need in the future and how do we truly transform something is a terrific mandate for all of us. And I look forward to taking questions. So thank you.
Okay, those were two very phenomenal projects that kind of approached everything at very different angles. And if you haven't typed your question in, please put it in the Q&A section now, and we can get started. Rocky, Chris, I know this question came up during your presentation. What was the time frame for completing the entire project?
It was it was two parts. So with Shorenstein, it was the purchase, the entitlement, the permitting, and then the construction. I mean, that covered roughly 3 years. And then there's a little lull period, and then the new tenants started showing up. And that probably was about a year where it was kind of in limbo. And then they showed up, and that probably took at least 3 years after that. So all in all, 7 or 8 years.
All right. Well, Rocky, go ahead.
It's amazing when I'm looking at Sarah's presentation. It's very amazing to look at. Both had trains running down both sides of these buildings. Both had doors on a repetitive trudge. And I think that's really neat that they're both in the same presentation here. Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful.
Oh, thanks.
Great.
Rocky, the next question is actually directed specifically towards you. It says, hi, Rocky. Was there any unreinforced masonry? And if so, how did you go about restoring rebuilding? What did
my goodness.
LADBS require of you?
So as we all know, the Los Angeles building code is unique. It has its own additive process. Takes about a year from the time the regular building code comes out. And they're pretty rigorous on the seismic retrofit, and we did have some retrofit. We chose to use the concrete structure to reinforce the building for the most part. So there's a series of seismic boxes that then have new collector beams that run along the bottom of the existing beams that are poured, that then stiffen the outside walls, some of which have some reinforcement. But in general, we're able to keep most of the outside walls as they are. And the brick is, it's not like massive 5Y wide brick. It's a lot of concrete with 2 or 3 Ys of brick. So very interesting. And of course, enormous openings between those concrete columns. So the brick is used as infill more than anything on this job. Hope that helps.
I believe it does. Sarah, I'm going to jump down to a question for you. What is the intended use of the large open deck space and the remaining enclosed building?
So the intended use of the building, it currently has a kayak store in it, and has had a restaurant and a little bit of history interpretation. And probably the most important thing it has in it is public bathrooms. And it will someday, we hope, it opened pretty much the day COVID happened, I think. And so we hope someday it will get a second restaurant and some additionals. It's about half filled right now. And then the deck has no official use, partially because of state lands, but I think as we imagined it, it's the it's sort of like a plaza or a great lawn where there's a kind of giant gathering area, and the way that it gets used, because it gets used all the time, there's a yoga class that happens out there, and there's a lot of dancing instruction that happens out there. So if we have time, I can pull up one of the videos, but there's events that happen on the deck, which are the kinds of things you would you would expect to happen in a plaza, but it's a plaza that happens to exist right at the water's edge. And that in terms of driving program, it's also just used by the one other surprise is having a flat outdoor level space near a bathroom is a kind of perfect condition for a 3-generational group. So a grandmother or a grandfather, a toddler, and a parent, because the toddler is away from the road and can scoot around and run, and the grandparent can walk safely on a level surface, and they're outdoors. And so I've had a number of people say it's the perfect 3-generational day trip. So it's been interesting. And so it's used in ways that we didn't expect as well.
That's interesting to hear.
Yeah.
I think this question I'm actually going to direct towards both groups. Did you pursue state historical registry? I apologize if you did say this in your presentation. And either one can go first.
Yes, we did. We had Shorenstein was a bit reticent. We had a historic consultant, Robert Shattle, and our LA approval had to go through the Department of Historic Resources at LA. Shorenstein did not choose to go the full way through Department of the Interior. So that was that. But we did follow all the guidelines, and it could easily have been done. They just wanted to get it back to market, I think. So as true developer, get it built.
Yeah, in my case, there had been a very protracted 10-year lawsuit on that question prior to our involvement that was resolved before we joined. And it is not on the historic register.
Was there any back and forth with the city of Oakland on that, or no? They don't get involved.
On the lawsuit, I mean,
No, on the historic.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people weighed in on whether the building had historic merit, and I think actually what happened was because of the lawsuit, it almost got to a sort of silly conversation of yes history or no history. And I think when we joined the conversation, we hadn't been a part of that dialogue because it was very contentious, and we're able to say some history is good, like kind of a more in between, and that's really the way that evolved.
That is really important for everybody on the call to hear. That was one way to approach it, and I think you did a wonderful job of that. So kudos to you. You don't always get the opportunity to be historic, but everybody in this call anyway, we all strive to do as much as we can, just like with LEED classifications and building green and all of that. We're all trying to do everything we can. And when you're working for developers, sometimes it's a challenge.
I will give a plug though. Oh, sorry, Chris, just that our project would not have happened without our developers, and there are some good ones too. No, go ahead, Chris.
Absolutely. Great ones, but they have a different mindset than an architect or a landscape architect.
Truth. Yeah.
So good or bad, there are lots of wonderful ones, but they have a bottom line to deal with. So it's a little different metric.
Mm-hmm.
And I was simply going to add that with our project and our developer client, we had originally encouraged them to strip the paint off the building. So much like the brick wall that you have in your backdrop there, Sarah. And ultimately, it was determined that it was too costly to strip the paint off. As you saw, it was like originally it was a red and a blue that had then faded over time to like a purple and a pink. And but we really were encouraging them to go back to the original just raw brick facade as it was back in 1912 and 1923. And they decided to paint the building a brick color. So that's how we sort of met in the middle there in terms of that.
Okay. Our historic consultant had a cardiac arrest, but we revived him.
Oh, no.
All right, I have a question for Rocky and Chris, and I'm actually going to combine two questions. Who is the window manufacturer on the factory windows, and were any of the windows reused?
All of the industrial windows were reused,
Mhm.
and it was not easy, not quick, and not cheap. They were all windows were reglazed, and they were reglazed with a laminated single pane or dual pane with a single 0.30 millimeter thing in the middle, plastic thing in the middle. Clear, has to be clear for historic reasons. And it was a lot of work. There was a lot of rebuilding. I think all of it was done by one particular
Consultant, I forget.
I'm thinking. Hold on.
And to add to that question, there were some there were some windows that were facing the cold storage building. If you recall, there was an appendage that had been built that was torn down that is in the area of the parking lot or the parking structure now. And when that appendage was removed, there were no windows, and in some cases they had some infill windows that were not original. But what we ultimately did, Rocky, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we had taken some original window frames and moved them from a non-public side of the building over to the public side of the building, because naturally from a historic preservation standpoint and our historic preservation architect and consultant, that which you saw from the public street was was a primary importance. And so those windows, we had, in some cases, we were just not taking the glazing sort of putty out and replacing the glass, but we were moving frames from one opening to another opening and then reglazing them.
Yeah, in most cases, those windows were stripped, blasted somehow, and then a new paint, which is pretty serious paint, was put on them, non-toxic, but automotive style paint. So,
and if you notice,
labor of love.
Yeah, it was a labor of love. If you notice in the historic photography, there were a lot of operable windows, right? Naturally, there was no air conditioning during that time, and that's how the building naturally ventilated. All those windows it was elected to, originally we wanted to keep them operable because a lot of them worked, even now, and but the developer client decided to, from a mechanical balancing standpoint and so on and so forth, decided to weld everything shut. So you still see the slight relief of those operable windows still is maintained in the facade, but unfortunately they don't operate anymore.
All right, we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to power through a few more questions. Please Sarah, please confirm how much square footage and the volume of the original building. Do you think you have an estimate for that?
I don't. I could give me a minute. I could look it up. I don't have it at the top of mind.
But then we can move on to a different question.
Yeah. The original building is close to 200,000 GSF, and I can roughly approximate what we saved, but give me a second.
Well, in the meantime, was there a CHBC used to any degree in the project? And did it benefit the project? Did you notice there was any challenges with the AHJ while applying with code or applying in that code? Sorry.
I need a translation of CH. I know what an
easy.
Yeah, I know what AHJ is, but what's the other one? Anyone?
Type it in the chat. Somebody.
Otherwise,
California Historic Building Code. No, because it was not a historic project. We had there's an architect of record on the facade and the walls of the interior space. And I should have mentioned this before, which is Michael Willis Associates, and they worked with them on that. But on the park parts, which is the piece at the end and the middle and the porch, no, we didn't work with someone on those parts. We had a lot of conversations about it, but that wasn't our driver.
All right, I have
And-
a question I'm going to direct towards all of you. Do you work with contractors that specialize in historical projects? Can you do projects
We
like
do.
this?
We do.
We don't
So-
usually get to pick ours, so no. So carry on.
So one of the contractors who worked with quite a bit is actually a subcontractor, and that's Spectra. And they've been a very good, they did all the windows, for example, they did all the cornice work and the repair of all the stone windowsills and stuff like that. So yeah, there are specialty contractors that we bring along when we can. We don't always get a choice. The Corn Show was Hathaway Dinwiddie, who most of you probably know from the original Getty Center up on the hill in LA. They were the contractor for that, not a small guy. And the Warner Music was another really good interior tenant improvement contractor, Howard Building Corp. So we had really good main contractors, and they brought in a really solid cadre of subs.
All right, with that, we are hitting 1 o'clock, so I am going to start wrapping things up here. I know everyone has places to be. First of all, I do want to say thank you so much to Sarah, Rocky, and Chris. It was phenomenal having you guys here and going over these projects. If you guys have time, then I will send questions afterwards that potentially you guys can answer on your project.
Sure.
And then I can send it out to those who attended in case they want the responses on those final few questions. And you're welcome to send me other questions if you didn't get a chance to type in your question. Just a reminder that next week on November 2nd, we have the Business of Architecture webinar, and that one is for one AIA learning unit. So stop by again and hopefully we'll see you then. Again, thank you so much for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much. Thank you.